Welcome to Research 401 as we take our next step as we look at all the different things we've covered when it comes to researching. Now, over the past few years, we've taken different steps to go through these things, and so we're going to take a look at some of the things that you've learned already and continuing on to understand what's this next new idea when it comes to researching. All right, here we go. First of all, we talked about searching online, and when it comes to searching online, of course, that's getting into the search engine and really understanding what a search engine is and how it works. And we came away with these three ideas. First of all, we came away with the fact that search engines offer various ways to search and to display data. And so you get lots of different kinds of lists based upon what they're thinking, and because you get all this variety, there's a lot of choosing that goes into that. And we talked a little bit about how to make those good choices in later lessons. Next we get to Bing. That's just an example. But next key idea then is multiple searches can bring better results. Right? So using different search engines because they think differently, because they search for keywords differently, it's good to use different ones because you might find the information you're really looking for when you're using those things. And then of course you have these top tricks that you can use, how to use the word and, how to use the word or, what happens when you put quotation marks around your words or minus signs to help you narrow down your results and really get exactly what you're looking for so you don't end up in some amusement park or something like that that happens to have a famous name like what something you're searching for. So we looked at those ideas when it comes to just searching online. From there we moved to really just looking at the websites themselves and looking at the idea of quality versus appeal. And sometimes this can be very confusing for students because the appeal really draws them in and can become a big distraction. However, when we look at a site, when we look for quality, especially when it comes to researching, right, we want facts about the topics. We want links to other useful sites, realistic pictures, and information from experts, not just random people, right? And that's where you get ideas like Wikipedia. Wikipedia maybe aren't necessarily the best choices for your researching options, even though it seems like it's very easy. Next, we have this idea of appeal, right? And sometimes we get drawn into sites because of what we like or what we dislike within a website. And of course, as you look at that idea, you remember that even though it looks fun, it might be fun, is it accomplishing what you really need it to be accomplishing? All right. And so we have that idea. From there, we moved on to the idea of rating sites. As you're really searching for that researching idea, what do you really need to ask yourself when you get to a site that you think can help you, right? You think it's quality. Now you're looking into it. What are the questions you need to ask, right? Can the author be trusted? Looking to figure out who is writing that information, right? Will this site have the information I need? Looking around, does it really cover the topic? Even though the big idea might be similar, does it fit the narrow spectrum that you're searching for? Is the site up to date? Always important. We want current information. We don't want something published 20 years ago or anything like that. And finally, is the site age appropriate? Can you understand the information? Are the words something you can read and understand? Is it someplace you need to be? And of course, with that, we came across some keywords, right? What it means to navigate, right? How to create bookmarks to find pages quickly as we're searching, just in case we didn't get time to write all the information down. We can bookmark them and go right back to them very easily on a computer. And what happens when you run into dead links or information that isn't working, and how this can really be a sign that maybe this isn't the best website to be on because it's not working properly, so it's probably not up to date. So we have that idea. From here we move on to our new lesson, right? We've looked at the idea of quality. You found a website you like, you you've determined that the information is important and it's good, and we get this big question: whose is it anyway? Whose information is that? Right? Too often in life we think that the internet is completely free, and there are many free aspects of the internet. But in the end, it kind of gets us to this picture of the idea of a painting, right? If you were to go into an art museum and start looking around at the paint, and if you really liked the painting, you wouldn't be able to walk out of there, even if you did purchase it, if you walk out of there and say, this is mine. I drew this or I painted this. Because somewhere in the corner or somewhere on the painting, artists leave their signature. And it's their claim to say this was a work by, and you can try and interpret the signatures on the screen. But when it comes to creating things, we like this idea of intellectual property. These are things that we created and they're ours, and we want the credit for it because we worked hard to do those things, to create those things. And it's the same thing with the information on the internet, is someone worked hard to put it there. Now obviously when we talk about quality, some people didn't work quite as hard as other people, but when you find the good stuff, the stuff that's worth taking off the internet, we got to think about, well, whose is it anyway? Can I use this? Can I make it a part of my presentation? And the answer is yes, you can use it, but you don't get to erase the signature off the painting and put your own and say, I came up with these ideas, I did all this work, because someone else did it, right? And when you choose to erase the signature, when you choose to say, this is mine, I did this all by myself, I did all the research, I learned all these things from scratch, and you don't give credit, we have a term that's known as plagiarism. We got a couple different definitions that come out of the dictionary as to what plagiarism is. So we have these three ideas. First of all, idea is to steal and pass off the ideas or words of another as one's own, right? Key thing here is it's not just the words, it can also just include the ideas, right? To use another's work without crediting the source. Right? We're going to be talking about crediting, what that really means. To present as new and original an idea or product that came from an existing source. And so basically what that's saying is somebody else has created something, and you have taken it and said, I did all this, I created this. And that's not really the case, because you didn't create everything. Even if you're writing a paper and you take one line from someone else, it destroys your entire paper because that one line belonged to someone else. And whether it's super significant to your paper or it's not significant to your paper or to your project or to whatever, you got to give credit for who it is, or else people are saying, wow, you did that work. And you didn't. You found it on the internet, someone else did that work, and you have taken it and said that it's your own. So let's look a little deeper into plagiarism and figure out, well, what really is plagiarism? I get the idea, I can't take things, but what are different examples of how people take things? And we can get into three types of plagiarism, three main types of plagiarism. And we're going to talk about these things one at a time. Right? The easiest one, the one that to some degree is the one that for teachers it's the easiest to catch. It's also the easiest for students to do, especially with what students can do now with this whole copy and paste thing on computers. You go on the internet, you highlight, you copy, you paste, you put it into your document, you put it into your presentation, and you're like, hey, I'm done. I just did all that work. Look at all this hard work that I did. But that very easily is not correct, right? And it doesn't matter if it's coming from the internet, from a textbook, from a magazine, from a newspaper, all those different things, copying someone else's work. It can even be if you take it from a classmate, right? Often we call that cheating. And it is a form of cheating, but plagiarism also just gets into, are you copying someone else's work? And so we have this explanation, right? If a writer copied the original without using quotation marks or a footnote, he or she would be guilty of plagiarism. Right? So that's one way that copying can be used. Now some people say, well, if I'm putting quotation marks around it, it's good. But copying actually goes a little bit deeper, because if the writer had lots of quotation marks, right? So we have just quote after quote after quote, then we would say you also copied too much, because you're relying on too much of another person's work, right? And the key idea is you gotta take some of these ideas and you gotta make them your own and put them into your own words. And we're gonna practice working with this in a little bit. Right. Our next idea is what's called paraphrasing. Right? And this is a process that is good, but according to copyright rules, and you need to still give credit if you're taking someone else's idea, right? Paraphrasing is taking someone else's ideas and putting them into your own words, right? Like I encourage you to do from the copying, right? You got to take something and put it into your own words. That's a good thing, right? It says so right there. This is good for summarizing. That's kind of what summarizing is. You read a paragraph, it says summarize what this paragraph was about, and you put it into your own words. However, if you are doing this for a paper, you must still use footnotes, right? Or depending on what style your teacher is asking you to cite your sources, you do a lot of paraphrasing. Maybe right at the end of the paragraph or at the end of the sentence, you put in a quotation where you got that idea from. It can be right there, right in the paragraph, or it could be lower down in a footnotes if you're using that style, right? And so you're using that style of paraphrasing, and you are putting in your own words, which is really good, but you're not really giving the person credit because it's still not your original idea, right? It's not your original idea. You're just taking that idea and rewriting it. And so that's called plagiarism, known as paraphrasing plagiarism. The last idea is what's known as patchwork plagiarism. And this is another one where students, they think they are summarizing, they think they're putting it into their own words, but they're really just kind of rearranging the author's work to make it seem like it's their own. Like using synonyms for different words. If I change just a couple adjectives or omitting little pieces here and there, and you're just saying, if I just do those things, now it will look like it's my own because I didn't copy it exactly word for word, right? And so that's our definition here, right? If a writer borrows phrases and clauses from the original and uses some of his or her own words, right? And in the end, we have this idea of a patchwork, a quilt, and that's what it kind of becomes, right? All right, now these definitions by themselves can be a little bit confusing. I think the copying one's pretty exact, right? You just copy exactly what it says. But let's take a look at some examples of what this can look like, right? So over here we got an original work by Richard Turco, and he's writing, this is just a couple lines about a nuclear explosion and some of what's happening within a nuclear explosion. Definitely could be a useful information if you're writing about nuclear explosions. But now we can see some different ideas of how plagiarism is used using what's called paraphrasing and what's called patchwork. All right. So take a minute and just read this paragraph quickly to yourself so you really understand what is going on. All right, now that you've read the paragraph, let's look at an example of paraphrasing. All right. I guess you can pause the video here if you haven't read it yet. Second warning. All right, here we go. So now we got paraphrasing, right? Fires could readily be ignited by a nuclear explosion either in cities or in the country because heat radiation from the nuclear explosion is equal to about 1/3 of the total of the energy yielded. Right? A lot of the same ideas, summarizing, and some good things going on there, but right, if you're going to do this, you got to put a citation in there, right? You'd have some parentheses here and say, I got most of this from Turco, right? Because that was the author who wrote that. But you can see how they just kind of, they did summarize the paragraph and kind of did it their own way, all right? Let's take a look at patchwork then. This is the one that, like I said, many people think they're getting away with getting out of the copying by using this process, right? So you can see how you have these pieces, right? An explosion from a nuclear bomb can start fires, right? That's something they wrote themselves, but then in either an urban or rural setting. They literally copied that little section right there. The light from the explosion, right? And then the white, which has a spectrum similar to that of sunlight, makes up about 1/3 of the energy produced. And so they're rearranging parts, but they're still using exact phrases from the original paragraph. And so those are examples of working with patchwork plagiarism. All right. And so if we really want to put things truly into our own words, we have an example of a good paragraph. It says, in the event of a nuclear explosion, several severe consequences would follow. For example, there would be immediate loss of life, destruction of property, and emissions of radiation. And even with this paragraph, you know, you could say you still want to put a footnote down there. You're still going to have stuff in your bibliography that says I used this person's source as an example for how I'm working things. But here you can see how this is clearly their own words. It's not Turco's original. All right, then, as we continue on, we just redefine, you know, what really is plagiarism. And, you know, we are looking at the idea of that phrase copycats, right? So lots of different ways, right? Turning in someone else's work as your own, right? That doesn't necessarily just include researching and things. It can also get into, you know, copying work. That's why teachers say you are cheating, right? Because technically you are plagiarizing. Okay, copying words or ideas from someone else without giving credit, failing to put quotations in quotation marks, giving incorrect information about the source of a quote. So even just not saying exactly who it was, you just say, oh, I think it's this person, right? Changing words but copying the sentence structure as a source without giving credit, right? So this is getting into that patchwork plagiarism, and then copying so many words or ideas from a source that it makes up the majority of your work, whether you give credit or not, right? That deeper definition of copying. Finally, now that we get a good, clear picture, you know, how do we avoid plagiarism, right? 3 really easy steps, right? And the fact is the sooner you do this, the more you do this, the more you practice this. Instead of giving into the easy road of just copying of plagiarizing, you're going to find yourself being happier and, you know, not having to redo things and different things like that. So first of all, express your own ideas, right? Whether it's a research paper or whatever you're doing, you know, you have created the thesis, you have created something that you are trying to figure out. And so it does come down to you and your ideas and how you, as you have researched and read things, how you have learned about those things. Okay, making sure you label your quotations when they are there, right? And then, you know, if you are summarizing or paraphrasing in a good way, right, make sure that you're citing your sources within the text in terms of, you know, putting in parentheses right behind the paragraphs who it is that you need to be, that you got that information from, or in that footnote, in that way, and that's going to get you away from plagiarism itself, right? You have those ideas. Then you may have some questions. Okay, I'm understanding plagiarism, but I'm not quite getting how do I do it the right way. And that's Research 501, and we'll get into that next time as we start to work with what does it really mean to cite a source, right? Now, this lesson that I just presented to you, most of this information came from this source that I'm listening to you right here. It's called Whose Is It Anyway? It's from Common Sense Media. That's who developed it. I got it off the internet on November 11th and accessed the information November 11th, so it's definitely up to date. And here we go, and that's the web link that you could get there. And so that's just an example of how to cite a source off the website. And next time we'll look at, well, how do you do this for books, for magazines, for newspapers, for the internet? What if you do an interview with someone? All those are different examples. Or what if you get an idea from a classmate and you really like that and you want to quote them and give them credit? How do you actually do that? And so we'll talk about those things as we get into Research 501. All right, that's our look at plagiarism. That's our fourth step as we look into what it really means to copy things. And we'll touch base with this idea again as we learn more about copyright and what's called fair use. And we're even going to explore a little bit deeper about, well, what about pictures off the internet? But that's all going to come in a later lesson when we get to those things. All right, that's it for Research 401.